Here I've got a Sega Mega Drive Mini. It's a really nice looking console, which looks just like the original Mega Drive. It comes preloaded with a bunch of original games. And there are a few really nice little details on the console, such as the movable volume slider, the opening doors on the cartridge slot, and the removable cover that hides the expansion port on the original console. What this particular console doesn't do, however, is work. And I'm going to be trying to change that in this video. Now I doubt this is going to take too much in the way of diagnosis, because the micro USB port used to supply power is visibly damaged, so hopefully that's going to be the only problem with the console. I'll just try powering it on with this power monitoring USB cable, and we'll be able to see that it doesn't register any power passing through. As you can see, it doesn't like this at all, and the monitor keeps resetting itself, and there's no activity whatsoever from the console. I'll just try powering it on with this power monitoring USB cable, and we'll be able to see that it doesn't register any power passing through. Taking a closer look, you can quite clearly see the damaged pins in the micro USB connector. Can't help but wonder how it managed to get in that state, but clearly it needs replacing. So let's get it opened up and see if there's any damage on the inside. There are six Phillips head screws holding this together, so now I've got all of them out. Hopefully it should come apart quite easily. I'll just zoom this in so we get a closer look at the inside. We can see it's pretty simple in here. Single PCB and a small heatsink. Before replacing the port, I'm just going to solder a couple of wires on so I can use a USB breakout board just to test that it does actually work, before I go through the whole process of trying to change the port. Not going to be brilliant solder joints, but that doesn't matter because this is only temporary. So now those wires are in place, I'm just going to use this little USB breakout board to plug it into the power and see if it now turns on. Yeah, so as we can see, the LED is lit up, which means it is just that connector that's faulty. I'm just going to remove these wires now, and then I'll take the board out so that I can start working on it. There are 4 Phillips head screws holding the board in place, so once these are taken out, it should come free from the bottom of the housing. To remove the old port, I'm just going to cut off the housing and then desolder the parts that remain. Unless you've got a proper desoldering tool, I find this the easiest way to remove these sorts of ports. It's important to be careful doing this though, as it's quite easy to rip pads off the board. I'd also recommend clamping the board down somewhere and not doing what I'm doing here, but of course I'm just trying to make sure that this is in shot of the camera. With the metal part of the housing removed, I have now clamped the board down so I can remove the last bit of plastic, clean up the pads and have a better idea of what I'm actually dealing with. Some of the pads are clearly damaged, and this became more obvious when adding the fresh solder. And so I decided to take a closer look to see if the damage could be repaired. Looking closer, it's quite clear that a couple of the pads are partially destroyed. But it should still be possible to get a new connector wired up, as there is still some pad there to solder to. Now before going into this, I should probably say there is every possibility I'm going to make this worse. But if it comes to it, I know there are other places on the board that I can solder wires to, so we can at least make sure the board has power. I've now added some flux onto the board, and I'm just going to use some desoldering braid to get rid of the fresh solder that I added, to prepare the board for a new connector. With the cleanup complete, the board's actually not looking too bad. The damage is largely confined to one of the pads used for data, and one that's used to provide the power. There shouldn't be any problems securely mounting a new connector in place. The difficulty will be making connections to those two pads. The soldering process took quite a while, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of what happened. Having soldered the connector in place through the non-damaged pins and pads, I tried using some fine pitch wire to get these last two pads connected. As it turns out, the power connector on the end was quite easy, as the pad was close enough to the pin that a blob of solder was enough to make the connection. The data pin, however, was a different story. After many attempts of trying to solder the wire in place, I managed to do what I feared would happen right at the start, by accidentally ripping off the last bit of the pad. This is the first time I've ever done this sort of soldering, so I'm not that surprised that it didn't go to plan. It's not too big an issue, as there is a component nearby that can be soldered to instead, and I did also make an attempt at doing this, though unfortunately that was also not successful. It's not a huge issue, and it's probably something I'll come back to at a later date, once I've got a bit more experience of this sort of soldering. It does mean that any of the software modifications won't now be possible due to that missing data connector. But as long as the power pin is now connected, the Mega Drive Mini should at least power on and be usable. The soldering didn't go fully to plan, but the power at least should be working, so I should at least be able to get it to turn on. I'm just going to do a quick test before I put it back in the case. The power LED's lit up, which is a good sign, though of course because this was non-functional when I received it, there is a possibility that there'll be something else wrong with it. Once I got it back in the case, I'll plug in an HDMI cable to check that we're getting output on the display. It's a really easy console to put back together, as long as you've kept your screws organised to make sure you're putting the right screws in the right place. With it assembled, all that's left now is to plug it in and see if we get video output. As you can see, this Mega Drive Mini is now working perfectly. Well, almost perfectly. If you don't want to flash any software onto it, then it works perfectly fine. And I have to say, the output looks rather good even through this incredibly cheap HDMI capture device that I'm using. I won't go into reviewing the console or the games that are on it, because there's plenty of reviews like that out there already, but I'm certainly looking forward to see what this has to offer. So there we have it, Mega Drive Mini mostly fixed. It's a bit annoying it's not completely fixed, but I do intend to come back to this later on and see if I can get that last pin connected. The main thing is though that it turns on and I can now play games on it, which really was the main thing that I was hoping for. I hope you like this video. Thank you very much for watching, and be sure to stick around for the next one.